Russian President Vladimir Putin suggested Ukraine be placed under a form of temporary administration.
During his stay in Arkhangelsk, Russian leader Vladimir Putin clearly explained his vision for Ukraine's future and the end of the Russian-Ukrainian war. His perspective has nothing to do not only with a just peace, but with peace as such. Putin continues to insist that his armed forces will destroy the Ukrainian army. The alternative, in his view, is the recognition that Ukraine as a state has failed and that power in the country has been seized by so-called Nazis. To prevent this threat, Putin proposes establishing external governance in Ukraine, essentially dividing the country into spheres of influence and transferring control over political processes to the United Nations. This would mean permanently depriving Ukraine of the possibility of real statehood, turning it into a protectorate of other countries, and most importantly, stripping the Ukrainian people of their subjectivity. Putin rightly recalls that such decisions have been made before, and in this, he is correct. Let us remember, for example, how the war in Bosnia and Herzegovina ended through US mediation. They agreed to a scheme that turned Bosnia into a de facto non-functioning and hopeless state for decades without eliminating the possibility of renewed conflict or the threat of Serbian influence over its sovereignty. Thus, the recipes Putin proposes do indeed exist, and they have already proven to be futile for the peoples to whom they were imposed, but not for Putin himself. To say that Putin's statement about external governance of a non-existent state or Nazis is some kind of revelation would be a huge exaggeration. One only needs to recall his speech on the night of February 23rd to 24th, 2022, when the decision for a full-scale invasion of Ukraine was made. That speech contained nearly all the same narratives about Nazis, a non-existent state, and the tragedy of the so-called people of Donbass, fabricated by Putin and his vile propagandists, referring to Ukrainians who remained in the Russian-occupied territories of Donetsk and Luhansk regions. At that time, Putin also spoke of the self-determination of the peoples of Ukraine, a remark that few paid attention to, neither in Ukraine nor in the international community. Incidentally, the population composition of Ukraine is no different from that of many European states that appear entirely stable in terms of national relations. However, Putin was prepared to declare the population of each Ukrainian region as a separate people, hold a sham referendum, whose results, by the way, are now uncritically cited by Trump's envoy to Putin, Steve Witkoff, and declare the annexation of that territory into the Russian Federation. This is precisely what happened after the start of the full-scale war with parts of Ukraine's Donetsk, Luhansk, Kherson, and Zaporizhzhia regions, territories brutally occupied by the enemy. And then, conveniently, all these so-called peoples are immediately forgotten. There is no longer any people of Donbass or people of Kherson, only the Russian people, while brutal and relentless Russification takes place on the occupied Ukrainian land. And it is precisely this scenario that the Russian president proposes to extend across all of Ukraine, perhaps with the presence of some UN contingents and carefully selected countries that would not obstruct Russian influence, Russification, and coercive pressure on Ukrainians and their state. After all, we understand that all these actions would take place when there is no longer a Ukrainian army and no real Ukrainian state mechanism left. Instead, there will only be a shell of statehood, filled with Putin's agents and collaborators, even if their appointments are coordinated between the Russian president and his American counterpart. This is precisely the plan that the Russian leader is proposing to his American interlocutor: peace through Russia's absorption of Ukraine, peace through the liquidation of Ukrainian statehood, peace through the Russification of the Ukrainian people, peace through the recognition that Ukrainians have no right to statehood and that Russians were justified in destroying Ukraine when they bombed, raped, looted, and occupied. However, once again, Putin's speech in Arkhangelsk is hardly a revelation. It is impossible to ignore the signals he is sending to Donald Trump and other Western politicians. After all, this entire speech was delivered aboard a nuclear submarine. Putin is subtly reminding them, if you do not agree to our deals, beware, nuclear war may come to you. But if we recognize this as mere blackmail from an experienced criminal who has built a mafia-like regime under the banner of the former KGB, the Russian Federal Security Service, we will understand that as long as these ultimatums are rejected and civilized nations act as they should, Putin will fail. The only way we can lose is if we start accepting Putin's ultimatum and discussing how best to fulfill it. Incidentally, Donald Trump recently admitted for the first time that Russia may be dragging things out and wasting time just to remain at the negotiating table. It is evident that the recent meeting between Russian and American diplomats in Riyadh convinced Trump that the Russian president is deliberately stalling to continue executing his own plan. The fact that no joint statement was released after the negotiations, that the White House and the Kremlin issued separate interpretations of what was achieved, that Russia is demanding significant concessions from the US for every step it takes while simultaneously refusing to consider a ceasefire. All of this has become increasingly obvious. The issue is not even that Donald Trump noticed it. One could assume that the American president had observed this before, but hoped others would not. However, now the fact that the Russian president is consciously, and I would even say demonstratively, using the American leader for his own purposes has become clear even to those who support Trump's foreign policy. And now, the American president is forced, at the very least, to pretend that he is beginning to understand Putin's true intentions. From this situation, only a few outcomes are entirely logical and predictable. The first is to persuade the world that Ukraine is the one being uncooperative. Trump has already tried to do this after his scandal with Zelensky in the Oval Office, but it did not work well for him. Support among Americans for Ukraine's resistance to Russian aggression remains high. Americans do not see Volodymyr Zelensky as a dictator, but they do see Vladimir Putin as one, and even a politician as arrogant as the current US president cannot afford to ignore public opinion. Putin is not giving Trump any advantages that he could use to justify his position. Moreover, the Russian Foreign Ministry has outright dismissed the illusions of the American president. For example, regarding the possibility of control over the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, Russian diplomats have made it explicitly clear what was already obvious. Russia considers the Zaporizhzhia plant to be an object located in the so-called Zaporizhzhia region, which they claim is part of the Russian Federation. Of course, they will never agree to international oversight of a nuclear power plant that, from their perspective, is on sovereign Russian territory. This example illustrates how any of Trump's proposals that fail to account for this so-called constitutional nonsense of the Russian occupiers are doomed to fail. This means one thing is undeniable. It is Russia, and specifically Putin, that is stalling for time. From this situation, there are two possible courses of action. The first is to acknowledge this fact, but continue operating within its logic, engaging in negotiations with the Russians without any real results while merely complaining to journalists. The second option is more politically assertive, but obviously less palatable for Trump, applying severe pressure on the Russian Federation itself, refusing to make concessions to Putin's regime, and seeking ways to intensify economic pressure on Russia. For example, imposing sanctions on countries that buy Russian oil, or at least targeting Chinese and Indian companies that continue to use Russian energy resources. In other words, demonstrating not a willingness to compromise, but a readiness to further dismantle the Russian economy. Naturally, this should also be accompanied by increased military assistance to Ukraine, as Trump himself promised when he ran for president of the United States. His own words, "If Russia refuses to negotiate, he will arm Ukraine." Trump may believe that Russia is engaging in negotiations, but these are not negotiations. They are blatant, calculated mockery not only of Ukraine, but also of the US president himself, whose authority will erode right before his eyes in favor of Vladimir Putin, a more cunning and arrogant politician than Trump. The question then arises, is Trump prepared to publicly yield to Putin and expose his own weakness and inability to influence the Russian president? This is a question Trump will have to answer in the coming weeks that will be far from easy for him. Thank you, friends. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss new videos. This material was prepared by Hustler. See you soon.